video guide to British birds. This new edition includes more moving footage than ever before and a brand new commentary written specially to fit the pictures and sound recordings. The net result is a complete guide to bird identification, explained in a way impossible with any other medium. This tape covers British species in systematic order, starting with skuas and ending with woodpeckers. It therefore includes a great variety of seabirds, such as the familiar gulls, the graceful terns, and the dinner-jacketed auks, as well as a number of medium-sized land birds, such as pigeons, woodpeckers, and the nocturnal owls. For a detailed list of contents, please refer to the card that comes with each tape. Notice that each species is given a reference number, corresponding to the one shown here. This number tells you the overall length of the bird in centimetres, from the tip of its bill to the end of its tail. The names shown on the screen are those recommended for international use by the British Ornithologists' Union. In the commentary, however, I've continued to use the traditional names, more familiar to most British birdwatchers. The clear and detailed illustrations by Alan Harris show the different plumages of each species at rest and in flight. The commentary concentrates on how to identify each species in the field, pointing out features which can be seen and heard as you view the footage of each bird. In trying to describe the rich variety of bird calls and song, I've often resorted to making my own imitations of these sounds. These are usually hopelessly unlike the real thing, but I hope you'll still find them useful. Think of them as translations of natural bird sounds into noises which any human, even me, can imitate and remember. The distribution of each species is shown by on-screen maps. Green shows areas where the species is present throughout the year, yellow shows where it is only found in summer, and blue shows the areas visited in winter. The distribution of very rare visitors is shown in grey. Now, let's begin this volume with Pomerine skua. Pomerine skuas are most likely to be seen as distant shapes flying over a stormy sea, identifiable only by the dedicated birdwatchers who have spent dozens of hours watching empty seas and hoping for moments such as this. The easiest way to identify Pomerine skuas is by their distinctive central tail feathers, long, broad and twisted like a pair of spoons sticking beyond the rest of the tail. Unfortunately, such well-marked adults are very rare around Britain, so instead we have to pick out the juveniles. These are very similar to the much commoner Arctic skua, but to a trained eye they are bulkier, more barrel-chested, with a slower, steadier flight. You may notice that the bill is contrastingly pale grey at the base and black at the tip, and if you see that the pale patch on the underwing is split into two by a dark line, then you can congratulate yourself for identifying it correctly. Their calls are unlikely to be heard in Britain. Pomerine skuas are rare visitors, which migrate through the North Sea, especially during August to October, when strong winds could bring them inshore or even inland. They also occur in impressive numbers off the Outer Hebrides in May. Arctic skua. The Arctic skua is an exciting bird to watch, as it hawks purposefully over the sea in search of a victim. Once it sees one, perhaps a kittiwake with a fish, it homes in and pursues it nose to tail, following every evasive turn like a guided missile. Eventually the kittiwake gives up and drops its fish, and the skua descends to pick up the morsel. The Arctic skua exists in two plumage forms. The dark phase is uniformly dark brown. The pale phase has almost completely white underparts, though sometimes with a dark breastband. In all plumages, it has an obvious pale panel in the primaries, visible from above and below. Adults have two elongated pointed feathers, sticking beyond the rest of the tail as a single central prong. Juveniles lack this prong and show a variable amount of barring in their plumage. Their varied calls resemble those of gulls, particularly kittiwake. A survey during 1985 to 87 showed that over 3,000 pairs of Arctic skuas were breeding in Scotland. Unfortunately, more than 90% of these were on the Shetlands or the Orkneys, where a crash in the population of sand eels has led to a succession of disastrous breeding seasons for the skuas. Migrating skuas can be seen along the east coast and in the English Channel, especially during August to October. Long-tailed skua. The long-tailed skua is the smallest and most slender of the skuas and flies with effortless elegance, even in rough weather. Adult birds are easy to identify with their extraordinary long central tail feathers and a unique pattern of pale chest but dark belly. The juveniles, however, without the long tail, can be much more difficult. The slender build is always helpful, and the upper wing usually shows only a trace of white in the primaries. But if a bird is seen as close as this, there are other things to look for. The pale nape and the pale markings on the mantle are dull grey, showing no hint of warm buff. The bill is relatively short and neatly two-toned. The primaries look completely black. There is an obvious dark, unmarked pectoral band, and there is regular neat barring on the undertail feathers. Their yapping calls will only rarely be heard in Britain. The long-tailed skua is the rarest of the four skuas, most likely to occur at coastal watch points in the autumn after strong winds. A few birds get blown inland, but the best place to see this species is the Outer Hebrides in May, when birds in adult plumage pass by in good numbers. Great skua. To walk through the territory of a great skua in July is an unforgettable experience, because these big bulky birds with powerful beaks will launch themselves at any intruder, often stooping in from behind and smacking you on the back of the head. It is the sheer bulk of this bird which makes it quite different from the other skuas. Its broad wings, short tail, big body and thick neck are more reminiscent of the bigger gulls, but this bird has bold white wing panels, even more conspicuous than in the other skuas. On their breeding grounds, they utter a variety of guttural noises. As with the Arctic skua, almost all the British great skuas breed on the Orkneys and Shetlands, where they are known as bonxies. The recent lack of sand eels there will surely reduce the numbers from the 7,900 pairs counted in 1985 to 87. Time spent sea watching at any coastal site, especially during July to October, should eventually produce a great skua, though they are much less frequent than the Arctics. Mediterranean gull. Mediterranean gulls have been increasingly frequent visitors to Britain, with about a dozen pairs now nesting amidst black-headed gull colonies around our coasts. Such breeding adults are unmistakable, with their complete black hoods, drooping red beaks, and, above all, broad, rounded, pure white wings, like a black-headed gull with the wings of a barn owl. Second winter birds also have obvious white flight feathers, but with conspicuous black spots towards the tips. First winter birds resemble young common gulls, but the black forewings and black lines through the secondaries are even more pronounced. At rest, non-breeding Mediterranean gulls of all ages have a distinct dark smudge behind the eye, often with some black extending over the crown. Compared with black-headed gulls, they are also chunkier bodied, with a heavier, more angular head and a thicker bill. How many can you spot here? Their calls are weaker and more nasal than those of black-headed gulls. Mediterranean gulls are now seen regularly around Britain, especially along the coasts of southeast England, where several pairs have bred. Elsewhere, they are still quite rare. Little gull. The little gull is the world's smallest gull, and this delightfully delicate bird is always a joy to see. The birds shown here are mostly in second winter plumage, which is very similar to adult plumage, except there is still some black in the tips of the primaries. These differ from black-headed gulls in their small size, smaller black bill, and the smoky patch on the crown. Even nicer are the first winter birds, like this one arriving here. They have a black and white zigzag pattern on the wing and a dark half collar like a young kittiwake, but the black cap is diagnostic. Juvenile birds have gorgeous scaly brown markings on the back, which this bird has almost completely lost. Little gulls have a buoyant flight and sometimes flutter to pick insects from the water like marsh terns. This second-year bird has lost the black W on the upper wing and now shows the same striking underwing pattern as an adult, smoky black, except for a broad white line around the trailing edge. Adults in summer plumage would have a complete black hood over the head. Their hard, kiek calls are more likely to be mistaken for a tern. Little gulls are scarce in most parts of Britain, but at a few favoured localities, mostly on the east coast, they can be quite numerous, with dozens occurring in August and September at places like Hornsey Mere. They can also be seen migrating at sea, with hundreds passing on certain days. Black-headed gull. Novice birdwatchers are often perplexed when they see gulls in winter with mostly white heads, which are called black-headed gulls, and then even more puzzled when you explain that in summer their heads actually become brown, although they do often look black from a distance. In summer plumage the dark hood only just covers the face and doesn't go down the nape as in the other dark-headed gulls. In winter plumage you have to look carefully at the distribution of black on the head and compare it with the dark eye mask of a Mediterranean gull and the sooty skull cap of a little gull. Juveniles start off with rather gingery brown patterning in the wing, but this is increasingly replaced by plain grey as the bird gets older. Black-headed gulls in all plumages have a white forewing, making a triangular white panel in the leading edge of the primaries. The grating calls of black-headed gulls can be heard in all sorts of habitats, from coastal sites to lakes, reservoirs and gravel pits, as well as rubbish tips and moorlands. This is probably our commonest gull, and certainly the one which is most often seen inland, where many of its breeding colonies are found. Common gull. Don't be misled by the name common gull. It can be very numerous in coastal areas and in the Scottish Highlands where it breeds, but in many areas it is far from common. It is most likely to be mistaken for a herring gull, but notice that it's much smaller, with altogether more delicate features, including the fine bill which lacks a red spot. It also has greenish legs and a deeper grey back than most herring gulls. In flight, the black in the primaries makes a more extensive wedge, with bolder, neater white blobs near the tips. Immature common gulls in flight have a conspicuous black wedge on the leading edge of the primaries. Their squealing calls have caused American birdwatchers to give them the name of mew gull. Almost 70,000 pairs of common gulls breed in Britain, mostly on islands, in lochs and rivers in the Scottish Highlands. In winter, they are also numerous around English coasts, especially in coastal fields. Herring gull. The herring gull is everybody's idea of a seagull, being present throughout the year at coastal cliffs, beaches, harbours and towns. It is familiar though at inland sites in winter, especially reservoirs and refuse tips. Its pale grey back separates it from the black-backed gulls, and its larger size, more menacing profile and red-spotted beak make it different from the common gull. First winter birds are harder to separate from the similar-sized lesser blackbacks, though they are slightly bulkier and the feathers of the wing and mantle show more extensive pale markings, making their upper parts look blotchy rather than mostly dark. In flight, the inner primaries are noticeably paler than the rest, making a diagnostic pale panel. Their bellowing calls, even if heard at an inland rubbish tip, always evoke images of the seaside. Herring gulls are very common all around the British coast, although there are also a few inland colonies. In many resorts, its noise and droppings cause a nuisance, so there are some who will be pleased that it has recently declined in Britain. Glaucous gull. The glaucous gull is a big brute of a bird, almost rivaling great blackback gull in size and meanness. Its so-called white-winged appearance in all plumages is distinctive, and its bulky appearance, heavy bill and relatively shorter wings distinguish it from Iceland gulls. The immatures have a striking black tip to the bill, neater than in Iceland gulls. Again, their gull-like calls are not particularly distinctive. In most years, glaucous gulls are slightly more numerous than Iceland gulls, especially in eastern England, since visitors arrive from Arctic Russia as well as Greenland. Like Iceland gulls, they favour harbours, reservoirs, rubbish tips and sewage outfalls. Iceland gull. Iceland gulls don't actually breed in Iceland, but visit Britain from Greenland and beyond. In all plumages they can be distinguished from most other gulls by their distinctively pale, mostly white primaries, with no sign of any black in the wing. The glaucous gull has a similar wing pattern, but the Iceland gull is a smaller bird, about the size of a herring gull, though slimmer, longer winged, and with a more delicate looking head. Immatures are mostly a pale creamy brown, with more extensive and less contrasting black in the bill than on a young glaucous. Their calls are similar to those of other large gulls. Iceland gulls are scarce winter visitors, most likely to be seen in the harbours of northern Scotland, but occurring annually in most coastal areas and many inland reservoirs. In cold weather, it is always worth looking for one in your nearest gull roost or at the local refuse tip. Lesser black-backed gull. The lesser black-backed gull used to be just a summer visitor to Britain, but now a proportion of its population stays in this country instead of going for a winter break in sunny Spain or Morocco. Adult birds are most similar to great black-backed gulls, but they are smaller and less powerful, and their dark grey backs are a few shades paler than the black in their wingtips. Also, their yellow legs, if visible, are a clinching feature. The immature birds are most likely to be confused with herring gulls, especially during their first winter, when neither species has started to acquire the diagnostic mantle colour. Lesser blackbacks, though, always seem to have darker wings and mantle, with each feather being mainly dark with pale edges. In flight, the young lesser blackbacks have consistently dark brown wings, without a pale area in the primaries. Their calls are rather similar to those of herring gulls, but weaker and more nasal. Nationally, this species is outnumbered by herring gulls by about 2 to 1, although lesser blackbacks generally seem scarcer because they are more concentrated into large colonies, such as on Skomer and Walney Islands. At inland sites in England, these birds can be numerous from July to November, but numbers then fall during the winter until spring migrants return in March. Great black-backed gull. The great black-backed gull is a really mean beast. It often scavenges like other gulls, but it not only poses a real threat to seabird chicks of all species, it can also attack, kill and eat adult birds as big as a puffin or a coot. Their beefy proportions and mighty bills help to identify great blackbacks of any age. In addition, the adults have a truly black back, not just dark grey, and the immatures often have conspicuously whiter heads than other immature gulls. Their calls are deeper and gruffer than those of other gulls. In winter, great black-backed gulls occur, usually in small numbers, throughout Britain, but in summer they are mostly restricted to the western coasts. Seabirds down the east side of England are mercifully free from their predatory attentions. Kittiwake. With its immaculately white plumage and delicate features, the kittiwake is one of the prettiest European gulls. It is most similar to the common gull, but is even smaller, about the size of a black-headed gull, with black feet and a lemon-yellow bill. Most importantly, they show no white spots in the wingtips, which characteristically look as if they've been dipped in black ink. Even if you can't clearly see the wingtips, the inner wing is obviously darker than the very pale outer wing, making this species recognisable at great distances. The immature has a black zigzag in the wing and a black half collar around the back of its neck. At a breeding colony, the constant chorus of kitty-way, 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 kitty-way is unforgettable. The kittiwake is an abundant but almost exclusively maritime gull, only rarely occurring inland except after strong winds. It nests almost entirely on sea cliffs, but has recently taken to coastal buildings, even if they are a mile or so from the sea. Sandwich tern. Terns are supposed to be elegant birds, but with their ridiculous shaggy crown, frequently drooping wings and harsh nagging call, sandwich terns really let the side down. They are bigger and bulkier than other British terns, with a short tail and no tail streamers. The wings are long, plain and particularly pale, and at close range the long black bill with a yellow tip is diagnostic. They almost always announce their presence with that unmistakable grating call. Kirik, kirik, kirik. Sandwich terns are quite common summer visitors to our shores, arriving in late March. They can be seen at most coastal sites, although they breed in only a limited number of colonies, mostly on islands, either offshore or in coastal lagoons. Roseate tern. The roseate tern is the very epitome of elegance, especially in flight. Somehow they appear to float on air, looking very white and almost ghostly, with long-tailed streamers quivering behind them. In theory, the best way to identify a roseate tern is by its mostly black bill with a red base, but common terns can show a similar pattern. To be sure, you need to check for the exceptionally long tail streamers, longer, brighter legs, and much paler mantle of a roseate tern. In flight, the elegance and sheer whiteness of the bird should make it stand out. The rosy pink flush on the breast is sometimes visible at close range, especially in spring, but don't expect shades of flamingo pink. With practice, a roseate tern can be located amongst other terns by its softer, wheezy calls. Sadly, the roseate tern is a very rare bird, with only about 90 pairs in Britain, concentrated into a few colonies, mostly in Anglesey, Northumberland and the Firth of Forth. They do occasionally turn up elsewhere, but the chances of seeing one are very slim. The population is declining even in Ireland, where there are another 400 pairs. Common tern. The common tern is so similar to the closely related Arctic tern that many birdwatchers admit defeat and simply call them comic terns. When an adult is seen at rest, look for an obvious black tip to a long crimson-red bill. And notice too that the black on the crown trails down the nape and that there is a more obvious white line between the bill and the dark crown. None of these features alone can be 100% reliable, but together they give the common tern a rather elongated-looking head. In flight, the problem is resolved if you see, as in this bird, an obvious contrast between dark outer primaries and pale inner ones. This feature becomes more obvious as the summer progresses, but can be hard to detect in early spring. The juvenile common tern is thankfully easier to identify due to an obvious dark area in the inner forewing. This makes a clear black shoulder patch when the bird is at rest. Common tern calls are stronger and more emphatic and include the characteristic pia, pia. Common terns are widespread around British coasts and are also the one tern most likely to be seen inland. Breeding colonies are normally on shingle banks or islands, including those on inland rivers and gravel pits. Arctic tern. Arctic tern is the world's most widely travelled bird, migrating every year from the Arctic where it breeds to the Antarctic where it stays during our winter months. Arctic terns can be very difficult to identify with confidence, especially at rest. The bill is shorter, more blood red in colour, and usually lacks the black tip shown by common terns. Also, there is only a tiny line of white between the bill and the crown, and the underparts are distinctly greyer, making the cheeks look conspicuously white. The crown is less extensive on the nape, giving the bird a skull-capped appearance. Finally, an Arctic tern has shorter legs but longer tail streamers, sticking beyond the tips of the wings. In flight, notice how this Arctic tern has a uniformly pale upper wing, whiter, not darker, towards the tips. And notice too the obviously pale cheeks and the long springy tail streamers. Indeed, the whole bird looks shorter-headed and longer-tailed than a common tern. Juveniles lack the dark wing panel of a common tern. The calls of Arctic terns are weaker than common tern, apologetic almost. Arctic terns have a more northerly and more strictly coastal distribution than common terns, being particularly numerous around the Scottish Islands. However, they also breed as far down as Anglesey and Northumberland, with a few additional pairs in East Anglia and on the south coast of England. Little tern. The sites chosen for breeding by this diminutive tern are often those which humans would wish to choose for a spot of summer sunbathing. Consequently, this attractive bird has recently disappeared from many former sites. It can be identified by its small size, ridiculously short tail, and almost frantic jerky wing action. The neat white forehead and black-tipped yellow bill are diagnostic. The outer couple of primaries are conspicuously blacker than in other terns. The chittering call of a little tern is like a much faster, softer version of the sandwich tern call. Colonies of little terns are scattered around most of our coastlines except in southwest Britain. The area between the Thames and the Wash is particularly favoured, but their preference for shingle beaches makes them vulnerable to human disturbance. They very rarely occur inland. Blacktern. Blackterns are most commonly seen flapping vigorously over a lake, reservoir or gravel pit. By patrolling up and down, they can scan the water surface for insects and collect them by dipping frequently downwards. This feeding technique alone would distinguish a blackturn from other terns, but they also have broader, more rounded wings, a fatter body, squarer tail and relatively shorter bill. In all plumages their wings look mostly grey. In summer they have black bodies with whiter tails. It is in winter or juvenile plumages that they look most similar to other terns, with white bodies and black crowns. But apart from their different shape and jizz, they can be told by their greyer wings and little black shoulder smudges. Their calls are typically abrupt and nasal. Blackterns very rarely breed in Britain, but they occur widely during times of spring and autumn passage. A few favoured localities, especially large lakes, attract dozens of these delightful birds every autumn. In early autumn they can regularly be seen migrating out at sea. Guillemot. With over 1 million pairs nesting in Britain, the guillemot is the commonest member of the auk family around our shores. They breed in spectacular noisy colonies, with birds crammed together at improbably high densities. The guillemot is best identified by its bill, long, wholly dark and gently tapering to a point. In flight they are slimmer and browner than razorbills, although they become increasingly darker plumage further north. In winter, guillemots have a pale throat and cheeks, marked by a characteristic dark line behind the eye, like the arm of a pair of spectacles. Some birds, called bridal guillemots, show the opposite colour pattern in summer. They seem to be wearing white-rimmed spectacles. This bird shows the typically streaked flanks, which also aid identification. Their appearance, like gentlemen in dinner jackets, goes well with their constant chorus of deep, bawdy belly laughs. Guillemots are found commonly all around the British coastline, although they disappear out to sea for much of the winter. Even so, there are hardly any breeding colonies on the east coast of Britain, except around Flamborough and the Farnes. Razorbill. The razorbill is the nearest thing left in the world to the now extinct great auk, which also had a black and white bill flattened sideways, but was much bigger and flightless. The almost rectangular bill, with 2 white lines, one vertical, one horizontal, makes the whole head of a razorbill look chunkier than that of a guillemot. Razorbills are also blacker and longer-tailed than guillemots, and tend to fly with their heads pointing upwards. In winter, razorbills show a black mask extending down below eye level, and lack the neat brown line which leads from the eye of a guillemot. Razorbill calls are deeper than guillemots, sounding more like a growling or even roaring lion. Razorbills are truly maritime birds, hardly ever seen inland, and spending most of the winter out in the open sea. From February onwards they return to our shores, and can be seen from almost any coastal site. However, they are much more numerous in Scotland, where some colonies contain over 10,000 birds. Black guillemot. The black guillemot is very scarce around the English coasts, but is more familiar around Scottish islands, where the Shetlanders have provided its alternative name of Teisty. Black guillemots can be identified in all plumages by the huge white splodge which covers most of the upper wing coverts, although in young birds this may be broken with grey mottling. In summer they are otherwise truly black, except for bright red highlights on the legs, feet and inside the mouth. In winter their underparts become white and the upper parts mottled grey. Their call is rather surprising for an auk, a long, high-pitched, penetrating whistle. Black guillemots nest in small loose groups rather than dense colonies, especially amongst piles of boulders by the coast. Such groups can be found from the Shetlands, down the coasts of western Scotland as far as Ireland, the Isle of Man and Anglesey. They are very scarce off eastern Britain, with no colonies south of Dundee. Little auk. The sight of a little auk should be a source of great delight, but often it is the cause of much sorrow, for it takes great winds to bring them close to British shores, and when they arrive they can be pitifully moribund. They should easily be identified, since they are only about the size of a starling, and they are so short and fat they seem to have no neck and no bill. Indeed, they are so barrel-shaped that in flight they've been described as flying cotton bobbins. In Britain, they occur in winter plumage, white from bill to tail and black above. The black extends over the eye, making a black eye mask, and there are curious white scratch marks on its back. At their breeding colonies in the high Arctic, they make excited chattering calls recalling kookaburras. Little auks are usually rare winter visitors to Britain, but strong winds can bring dozens to within sight of the shore, and some birds are even driven inland. Puffin. What a character the puffin is, with his deep, multicoloured, parrot-like bill and pure white face with clown-like markings around his eyes. In summer, the colourful bill, white face and red feet make them easy to separate from the guillemots and razorbills. By winter, the bill has shed its outer, more colourful layer, so it appears smaller and duller, and the face too becomes a duller, smoky grey. However, the shape of the black outline to the face is still clearly visible. In flight, the lack of white, both in the sides of the tail and on the trailing edge of the wing, are further useful features. Puffin calls consist of long, slow, painful moans, at times like a patient trying not to laugh. Puffins nest in underground burrows like rabbit warrens. Their colonies are scattered around the British coast, usually on offshore islands. The greatest numbers are in Scotland, where some sites have over 50,000 pairs. Elsewhere, they can be seen from almost every coastal site, though they are usually scarcer than guillemots and razorbills. As with other auks, they disappear out to sea during the winter. Rock dove. The wild rock dove is a bird of coastal cliffs, especially in northern and western parts of Britain, but this species is much more familiar as the feral pigeon or racing pigeon found in towns and pigeon lofts. The feral birds freely interbreed with the wild populations, so there is little chance of seeing a genetically pure rock dove in Britain. Good rock dove features include a neat white rump, two broad clear black wing bars, and a head which is clearly darker than the rest of the body. Feral pigeons can of course have various plumages, but are often darker overall, with extra areas of white or brown, and often with grey, not white, rumps. In all plumages, rock doves have more sharply pointed wings and cleaner, whiter underwings than other pigeons. Their song is the familiar rumbling cooing, more monotonous than in other pigeons. Feral pigeons are found almost universally throughout Britain, except in parts of Scotland and Wales. To see birds showing true rock dove characteristics, you should look at northern sea cliffs. The more remote, the better. Stock dove. The stock dove is an attractive bird, which is sadly overlooked by many bird watchers who dismiss it as just a pigeon, because they can't be bothered to distinguish it from feral pigeons. At rest, they just look uniformly dull grey, unless you are close enough to see a shiny green patch on the side of the neck, a pinkish breast, and only very small black bars in the wing. In flight, they again look dull grey, apart from a diagnostic broad black border around most of the wing. Their song is a pleasant but boringly repetitive oot, oot, oot. The stock dove is widespread throughout most of Britain except Scotland, but relatively scarce and declining in Ireland. It nests in holes, usually in trees, but also in old farm buildings, so it prefers areas of mature open woodland or parkland, or farmland containing abandoned buildings. Wood pigeon. The wood pigeon is a familiar constituent of the British country scene, with most woodlands resounding to their cooing songs or clapping wing beats. They can breed at almost any time of year, being willing to lay their 2 eggs at every opportunity, and abandon them with equal ease. Easy come, easy go. Wood pigeons can be identified in all plumages by the obvious white marks at the bend of the wings, which show up in flight as diagnostic white lines down the middle of the wing. Another good feature is the neat white patch on either side of the neck, although juveniles lack this mark. Compared to other pigeons, the wood pigeon is bigger and more ponderous in flight, with a deeper belly and a longer tail. The complete cooing song of the wood pigeon has 5 notes. Roo-hoo-hoo, roo-hoo, roo-hoo-hoo, roo-hoo. But sometimes the last 2 syllables are omitted. The wood pigeon is an abundant bird of woodland, parkland and farmland throughout Britain, and is increasingly spreading into town centres. Collared dove. The collared dove had never been seen in Britain before 1952. Try telling that to young uns today and they just won't believe you. In fact, the population spread suddenly from around the Balkans and quickly colonised the rest of Europe, so effectively that even here in Britain it is one of our most familiar birds. Collared doves are much smaller than the pigeons, with a longer, narrower tail and pinky buff plumage. They are easily told from turtle doves by their plain upper parts and neat black line around the back of the neck. The cooing has 3 syllables and a much more emphatic finish than any wood pigeon song. Hoo-hoo, hoo-hoo, hoo-hoo. Collared doves have already spread to most parts of the British Isles, although they are notably absent from many upland areas. They can be extremely numerous around certain farms, but they seem to favour parks and gardens above all. Turtle dove. The turtle dove is the only member of the pigeon family which leaves us in winter, and that could prove to be its undoing. Surely they would be safer here than in drought-ridden parts of Africa, and without having to migrate through Mediterranean countries in which millions of turtle doves are shot every year. For whatever reason, the reassuring purring song of the turtle dove is being heard much less frequently than before. They are similar in size and shape to a collared dove, although they have a shorter tail, more pointed wings, and a more darting, agile flight. The checkered black and rufous upper parts are diagnostic and easily seen. Look also for their darker underwing, the narrow white border around the tail, and the black and white collar patches like the gill slits of a dogfish. The purring song is an unmistakable sound of summer. Turtle doves are still widespread in areas east of the line from Teesside to Portland Bill, but have disappeared from most other areas. Favoured habitats include scrubby embankments, hedgerows and copses. Cuckoo. When cuckoos return to Britain every April, they announce their arrival with their unforgettable songs, then get on with the business of plonking their eggs in the nests of other birds. When the cuckoo nestling hatches out, it instinctively throws out every other object in the nest, thereby getting rid of the eggs or nestlings which got there first. The young cuckoo then provides such a compulsive feed-me stimulus that its foster parents, and indeed any other passing bird, can't resist stuffing it with food. Eventually it will migrate to exactly the right part of Africa before it has ever had contact with another cuckoo. Amazing, isn't it? Cuckoos are blue-grey birds with white, closely barred underparts. Their short wings and long tail are suggestive of sparrowhawk, but the wings are clearly pointed, more like a falcon. However, their fluttering flight, with quick shallow wing beats, is distinctive, mainly because the wings are always held below the horizontal level. Juveniles are usually a dull dark brown, heavily marked with black, and with a pale patch on the nape. Apart from the obvious cuckoo song, they also make a rather magpie-like chuckle and a fast rippling trill like the start of a curlew song. Cuckoos occur throughout Britain in a variety of habitats from lowland reed beds to upland heather moors, although they tend to shun built-up areas. Barn owl. In the days when barn owls nested commonly in church towers, their chilling, screeching cries must have deterred many a courting couple from lingering in the graveyard. Nowadays the barn owl is much rarer, and you are fortunate indeed to see its ghostly white figure hunting over fields, silent but deadly. The sheer whiteness of a barn owl makes it easy to identify. Other owls can look very pale when caught in the glare of car headlights, but only the barn owl is completely white below, even in its face. The screeching calls of the barn owl have a distinctive mechanical whirring quality. Barn owls have become increasingly scarce over the last 50 years or so, and have disappeared from large areas of central and southwest England, South Wales and most of Ireland. However, in southern and eastern England they still appear to be thriving, and with the reduction in pesticide usage, there is some optimism that numbers will recover. Little owl. Little owls are not native British birds, but were introduced here during the previous century. Now we have maybe 10,000 pairs, so there are many places where you might spot one glowering furiously at you. Little owls are easily recognised by their small, squat, flat-headed, long-legged shape and relatively grey plumage heavily marked with white. They have a distinctively bounding flight, showing broad rounded wings before they land. Little owls produce a whole variety of calls, but by day you are most likely to hear a barking kyo, kyo. They are widespread throughout most of England, but they become very scarce north of Yorkshire and west of Cardiff. The population seems to be declining, especially in Lincolnshire, East Anglia and southwest England. They prefer relatively open country with scattered hedgerows and trees where walls, buildings or old nests provide nest holes. Tawny owl. In television dramas, whenever the hero steps outside at night, he hears a familiar to-wit-to-woo. He looks up, and there, perfectly lit, is a tawny owl blinking down at him. If only life were like that. The tawny is the big brown owl of most of our parks and woodlands, readily identified even in silhouette by its bulky outline with big broad rounded head. It is the only British brown owl to have completely dark eyes. The best way to find one is to listen for the alarm calls of other birds, especially if several species are involved. The squawk of a jay, the rattle of a mistle thrush, the tutting of a blackbird and the pinking of a chaffinch are all, especially if perpetuated for some time, sure signs of a predator nearby, although sometimes it may prove to be just a cat. The hooting song of the tawny owl is familiar to everyone, but the kiwik calls are also distinctive. Tawny owls occur throughout Britain, but not in Ireland. They may prefer deciduous woodland and parkland, but many have also colonised coniferous forests. Long-eared owl. Roosting long-eared owls can be incredibly difficult to see, even when someone is trying to point one out to you. When you do eventually see that brown thing has got the most gorgeous orange eyes, you are suitably impressed. Then, once you know what to look for, you might look around and find 6 more in the same bush. At rest, the long ear tufts and distinctly orange eyes make the long-eared owl easy to recognise. In flight, though, they can be confusingly similar to short-eared owls. The most obvious features to look for are the uniformly dark underparts, the lack of a white trailing edge to the wing, and less distinct barring everywhere, especially under the wingtip. To find long-eared owls in spring, listen at dusk for the soft, booming hoots of the male and the higher-pitched common paper calls of the female. Successful pairs are best located by listening for the squeaky gate calls of the young in June or July, unmissable after dark. Long-eared owls occur at scattered localities throughout Britain, although they seem to be disappearing from many areas, especially in Ireland. They could be found wherever there is dense cover close to open hunting areas, such as where plantations adjoin open moorland. Dense hawthorn thickets are also popular, not just for nesting, but also as roosting sites in winter, when Britain receives an influx of continental birds. Favoured sites may be used by groups of long-eareds every winter. Short-eared owl. Unlike the other owls, the short-eared habitually hunts by day, which is good news for birdwatchers who love to watch their light, buoyant flight and be transfixed by their glaring yellow eyes. However, it isn't safe to assume that a day-flying owl, even over moorland, is sure to be a short-eared. To eliminate the possibility of it being a long-eared, you must look for either a pale belly contrasting with a streaked head and chest, a white trailing edge to the wing, neater, more distinct barring on the upper tail, upper wing and under the wingtip, and the yellow rather than orange eyes. Also, the colour of a short-eared varies from undercooked biscuit brown to overcooked biscuit brown, and never shows the warm rufous tones of a long-eared. At rest, the ear tufts are hard to see, but the yellow eyes are distinctively encircled by black. They are usually silent. Call. Look upwards to see whether the male will perform dramatic wing-flapping displays. Short-eareds are primarily birds of open and grassy moorland, where they breed in varying numbers depending on the supply of voles. They are therefore most frequent in summer in Scotland and the Pennines, but these birds usually move to lower ground in winter, especially coastal marshes and wet meadows. Nightjar. What a treat it is to experience this scarce and declining bird at a breeding site on a summer evening. Just sit quietly and listen for its deep, rumbling, churring song, and perhaps even the soft tap-tapping of its wings. And watch against the fading light for its long, slim silhouette, flicking with great agility, then gliding on raised wings like a paper aeroplane. Nightjars are long-winged, long-tailed, mottled brown and grey birds, rarely seen by day. If you should flush one, it can be told from a cuckoo or a falcon by the way it invariably keeps its wings held up above the horizontal. In the early evening, you may see the white spots near the wingtips and in the corners of the tail. Apart from the wonderful churring sound, nightjars also make frog-like calls, boink, boink, as well as rather frantic wing-clapping sounds. A survey in 1992 revealed over 3,000 churring males in Britain, mostly on lowland heaths in East Anglia and southern England, but with a scattering of reports from as far north as Scotland. Nightjars are summer visitors, not arriving until late May. Swift. The swift is the most aerial of all birds, feeding, mating, and even sleeping on the wing. They only perch in order to breed, and so must fly non-stop outside the breeding season, going 8 or 9 months without landing. Swift appear most closely similar to swallows, but they have longer, stiffer, more sickle-shaped wings, and their plumage is all dark, almost black, except for a paler chin. Their screaming calls are a welcome sign that summer is really here. Swifts arrive mostly during May, and most of them have gone again by September. They breed in crevices, especially in buildings, so they are frequently encountered in towns and cities, even on busy streets. They can fly for miles in search of food, and so can be seen overhead almost anywhere in summer. Kingfisher. The stunning blue flash of a kingfisher dashing away over a stream is a sight which is probably more familiar to fishermen than to birdwatchers, for kingfishers are notoriously difficult to see, except by waiting silently. Their brilliant blue upper parts, deep red underparts, white face patches and unique shape make kingfishers impossible to misidentify. The red lower mandible tells you that this bird is a female, but this one with an all-black bill is a male. Their shrill penetrating whistles are well worth learning to increase your chances of seeing one. Kingfishers occur widely but sparsely throughout most of England and Wales, with far fewer in Scotland. They will occupy fast-flowing streams, rivers, canals or mill ponds, as long as they contain fish and have vegetated banks which offer perching posts. Hoopoe. The hoopoe is a bizarre creation with crazy black and white banding across its wings and tail, an eccentric black-tipped crest, long down-curved bill and an orange-coloured body. Its dramatic plumage is best seen when the bird flies, with floppy, rounded, fingered wings flicking like a big moth. Even its call is unusual, a soft, slightly booming poo poo poo. This is really a bird of Mediterranean countries, but it turns up regularly as a migrant in Britain, especially in spring. It feeds in open areas, probing its bill into soft ground, so it might be found on lawns, golf courses or playing fields. This is one migrant which is likely to be reported by even the least interested observers. Wryneck. What a weird bird the wryneck is, with feet like a woodpecker, plumage like a nightjar, call like a falcon, and usually all the jizz of a statue. It gets its name from its ability to twist its neck, so that it can face forwards and look backwards at the same time. Wrynecks aren't difficult to identify. The stout grey bill suggests a big warbler, but none of the warblers have this cryptic grey and brown plumage. A bigger problem is actually seeing a wryneck, for they frequently freeze and pretend successfully to be a branch. Just listen for their piping, rising calls, then scan carefully through the trees. Wrynecks are scarce but regular migrants to Britain, especially on the east coast in late August and September. Sadly, the wryneck, once widespread in southern England, is now virtually extinct as a breeding bird in Britain, with just occasional sightings in summer in suitable habitat. Green woodpecker. The loud, laughing call of the green woodpecker has earned it the country name of the yaffle. Without this unmissable and characteristic call, this species might go largely unnoticed in many wooded areas, despite its large size and handsome colours. The green upper parts, yellow rump and distinctive shape makes this an easy bird to identify. The crown is completely red in all plumages, but this bird is a male because he has a red stripe in the black moustache. This immature bird is heavily speckled below. Green woodpeckers are widespread and relatively abundant south of Leicester, but north of here they are much more scattered and local. They are birds of mature open woodland and parkland, with old trees for nesting, plus open, preferably sandy areas where they can search for ants. Great spotted woodpecker. The great spotted is by far the commonest of our woodpeckers, its distinctive drumming displays being a feature of woodlands throughout Britain. Its trunk-clinging habits, characteristic shape and black and white plumage eliminate all other British birds except the lesser spotted woodpecker. Apart from being much bigger, the great spotted is easily told by the big white patches on its shoulders, as well as the red on the tail coverts. Immatures have red along the crown, the male has a red spot on the nape, but the female has no red on her head at all. The white shoulder patches show up clearly in flight, which is characteristically bounding. The drumming sound is a sure sign of a woodpecker, but the explosive chick, chick call is heard much more frequently throughout the year. Great spotted woodpeckers are widespread and numerous in England and Wales, except on treeless hills, but they have only a scattered distribution in Scotland and are completely absent from Ireland. Lesser spotted woodpecker. The lesser spotted woodpecker is one of the most elusive British breeding birds. Many bird watchers go years before they eventually see one. The trouble is they are very small, no bigger than a sparrow, and spend most of their time in the higher branches of trees, usually without calling. On top of all that, they are scarce birds anyway. Apart from its tiny size, you can easily recognise one because its upper parts are crossed with numerous narrow white bars instead of big white patches, and the underparts show no red. The female has no red on her head, but the male has a red crown. In flight, The lesser spotted is so small you may not realise it's a woodpecker, but the rounded wings and short pointed tail should provide clues. This species drums less frequently than the great spotted, producing a sound which is slower and goes on for longer. In spring they also give a shrill call like a falcon, but more feeble. Lesser spotted woodpeckers occur widely throughout most of lowland England and Wales, most frequently in the southeast, but even here they'll take some finding. They occur in mature broadleaf woodland and parkland, often in the decaying trees close to lakes or rivers.